So welcome to Feature Fridays. My name is Guy Bartram. I'm the Director of Product Marketing for our cloud providers at VMware. And today I'm joined by Ewen from PX3. Welcome, Ewen. Thanks a lot for joining and coming on the show. Do you want to just...
Very good to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. Do you want to just introduce yourself? Tell us, about yourself and PX3. Who are PX3 and what do you guys do?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. Ewen Anderson, I'm co-founder and CIO at PX3. As an organization, we're focused on providing organizations with information around IT sustainability. So that really takes two main sort of focuses for us as a business. So one is to work with technology companies to assess the carbon footprint or sustainability of products and services that they might either have or be planning to bring to market. So we work with the likes of Microsoft, Google, Acer, ASUS, Qualcomm, organizations like that. So looking at anything from delivering desktops in the cloud through to the impact of using a particular processor within a form factor like a laptop.
Right. Okay.
So that side of it is scientific research. So the sponsors of that research get to determine what the question is, but they don't get to determine what the answer is. So it's independent, it's scientifically validated research. And it's worth pointing out that our chief scientist, my co-founder, Justin Sutton Parker, has just completed his PhD in IT sustainability at the University of Warwick, and we're based out of the University of Warwick Science Park. And that's kind of our key differentiator is we base all our recommendations and findings on published peer-reviewed science, and that sort of spectrum from assumption-based to science-based is really important in terms of making genuine decisions and being an influencer at the level where we work, which is for major international companies, government level, as well as down to smaller organizations. The other side of the business is really focusing on doing baseline assessments for organizations. So that's looking at their end user computing estate, their data centers, their networking, potentially as well their commute and other things that are sort of, related emissions factors. Providing a baseline, calculating that out to a high degree of sensitivity and granularity. And then based on that model, running what if analysis. So, what if we move to lower energy, lower footprint devices? What if we moved some of these workloads to hypercloud providers or hosting services? What would be the impact on our emissions? So in a nutshell, that's us. That's what we do.
Okay, so is this really hot topic at the moment, sustainability in general? How have you seen in the last couple of years this market change and the pressure for organizations to start looking at and measuring their sustainability and things like renewable energy, hardware, like you said, data center fabric, etc. How has it changed from your view from PX3? What have you seen in the industry?
Well, I think it's fair to say that when we set the business up 5.5 years ago, there was very little interest in what we were doing. There was a certain amount, it was starting to appear, and certainly Justin's been involved in sustainability for more than 10 years, going back to his MBA. So very much he's been shouting about this as a topic for all of that period, for more than 15 years. But probably 3 years ago, we saw a sudden upsurge of interest, particularly in Scope 2. And again, it's worth just sort of briefly touching on this. We can go into it in more detail, but Scope 2 is the emissions caused by the energy that you use in running your organization, running your business. So, data centers, obviously drawing power from the grid, devices drawing power from the sockets, those are creators of Scope 2 emissions. And that was the main focus because that's where the government compliance legislation was around declaring Scope 2 emissions. What we've seen, particularly over the last 12 to 18 months, is an increasing interest in Scope 3 emissions, which is the embodied emissions produced by manufacturing, by packaging, distributing, and then ultimately disposing of those devices as well. So because that started to come through into both UK and EU legislation in terms of reporting on those emissions, it's become as you say, a hot topic, both for the organizations themselves who are now required to report on scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. And by definition, because that's moving into supply chain, they're requiring their suppliers to start reporting on the scope 3 emissions of what they are being supplied with. So yeah, it's absolutely gone from something that people were vaguely interested in at a personal level to being an ESG commitment, at a corporate level, a KPI, certainly for the sustainability team, and then increasingly this is flowing through to be a KPI for the CIO stroke IT director as well.
Right. And this is really important for organizations today, right? I mean, you've got obviously your in organization direct kind of energy greenhouse gas emission, which is that scope 2 that you said.
Yep.
But as as more and more organizations start using cloud fabric and running their stuff effectively in someone else's data center, all of that energy consumption then, what moves into the data into the hosted data centers then converts to a scope 3 indirect emission, and that's I think where I kind of want to talk about how does an organization today look at measuring that and working with their provider to do that? Are there any? Have you seen examples of providers who provide this data to their customers, or is that a trend that you're seeing now starting to emerge?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say it depends on the provider as to whether or not that information is readily available. So some of the hypercloud providers are now providing that data, particularly for larger clients. Mm-hmm. And we've seen a lot of the independent providers generally are providing power consumption data, for time periods, which is specific to the clients that they're serving. So when we're doing our reporting, that's one of the things that we do. We'll reach out to the provider to ask for the energy consumption for particular workloads in the data center of a particular period of time. It's typically looking at a year. So yeah, I think it's becoming a more normal request. I think where it becomes more difficult, because clearly, as you say, that's a scope 3. It's a supply chain emission question from the customer side. But the customers are now starting to say, well, actually, we want to know more about the scope 3 emissions. So we want to know about the equipment that is providing the service as well, because that's a scope 3 emission as well. And that's more difficult by the very nature of cloud service providers, because where is that workload running and what kit is it actually running on is not nearly as easy as what is the power draw from the racks that we know are associated with this particular customer.
Yeah.
So that's becoming more of a challenge, and I know it's quite a contentious issue between some of the hypercloud providers, and particularly with central government at the moment, where these questions are being asked, saying, well, we want to know the electricity consumption, and the fact that you're committing to renewable energy or a green energy provider, that's fine, but we still want to know the kilowatt hours in terms of energy consumption, and we will then calculate the carbon emissions associated with that. But then we want to know those scope 3 emissions for the equipment, and we want to know what the equipment is, how long you're keeping it for, and what you're doing with it when it's reached end of life.
Wow, there's a lot of things to take into consideration, isn't there?
Well, yeah, as I say, the flexibility of cloud kind of predicates the fact that you don't have to answer those questions, because your responsibility is to provide a particular workload at a particular performance level at a particular cost. But if we look at it from a procurement perspective, what we're now saying is, well, actually, in order to qualify to supply, then you're going to have certain ESG commitments, at an environmental and social governance company level. You're going to have a net zero strategy. Otherwise, you will not be allowed to supply anything of significance, to the public sector.
Yeah.
Equally, from an EU perspective, if you haven't got those commitments in place, you won't be supplying. If you've got more than about 250 employees, basically you will not be supplying anything to anybody within the EU. But equally, as we move through that, the ESG commitments are much broader than just sustainability. So you've got all your diversity and inclusivity, you've got modern slavery working practices, your whole supply chain needs to be, or approved, if you like, and publicly stated to say that you've met those requirements. Then you've got a set of corporate benchmarks to meet, and that might be the EcoVadis scores or commitment to science-based targets or carbon disclosure.
Yeah.
It's like a gateway. If you haven't got those things, you won't be in a position to supply. Having got through that qualification period, then the more normal metrics start to apply around cost, flexibility, user experience, reliability. But then what we're seeing is an increasing reliance or request to say, right, so the service, what are the scope 2 and scope 3 emissions? And not just what are they according to your calculations, but what are they as they apply to us as an organization? So, put it into our context, as in, where will our workloads be running? And what will the emissions associated with our service be? What's your projection on that? Particularly the use of remanufactured materials and recycling at the end of life. So those are the sorts of product commitments that then come in. And then you've got that weighting, which is cost, sustainability, and functionality, give you that final weighted decision. But you've almost had to make it through a series of gates to get to a point where most of us thought we were starting. So it's kind of interesting to see how that's evolved, but it is evolving very quickly. And a lot of the public sector legislation like PPN 621 that's come in mean that you have to start measuring this and you have to start declaring it. But then, as another example, the green code that came in from the Competition and Markets Authority means that if you make statements around this, you also have to be able to back them up. So you have to have a scientific reason as to why you are saying this is a sustainable service or it's a net zero service. You'll have to have some form of independent verification. And if we look at the EU, the CSRD legislation that's in force for the financial year starting 2024, there's a requirement in that to have it independently verified. So it won't be enough just to say we've got a net zero strategy. There's some audit requirement around that. Now, it's not entirely clear who is authorized to audit what, and there's very limited genuine qualifications on this topic. But the requirement is in there at a country level to say, when you're going to make a statement like this and you're going to put it in your accounts, if you like, that somebody else is going to have to sign that off as being independently assessed and verified. So it's certainly getting more complicated as a topic, put it that way.
Yeah, so I mean, the advice to our cloud providers then is, like, in the EU, I think, what was the revenue limit they set for?
I think it's about 250 million.
Yeah, so if you're an organization earning over 250 million as of 2024, you have to start reporting on 2023. Yep. And you need to provide this this clarity and independent auditing of this. Is there going to be fines imposed? Do you know what the penalties are for not disclosing this information?
I'm not sure that that's being determined. It's been put in as a compliance statement. So undoubtedly, it won't be long. With some sort of regime. So absolutely. I mean, as I say, the UK government's taken it kind of from the opposite angle, where under PPN 621, if you don't have those things declared and in the public domain in terms of your net zero strategy for scope 2 and agreed elements of scope 3, you just cannot supply. Equally, the TPAS that's just come out for the Crown Commercial Services supply, again, UK specific, but in that you have to have a baseline carbon footprint and a carbon reduction plan, or you won't be allowed onto the major government frameworks to supply under those either. So it's kind of as I say, coming the other way at it from a customer perspective, saying if you don't qualify, you won't supply. Whereas from an EU perspective, it's at a governance and compliance perspective, saying you have to do this now in the same light as you would disclose your financial performance. This is now, the environmental elements are under the same legislation and stringency as finance. So yeah, I would suspect it would be backed up with fines if there's nothing specific.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think when you're looking at the UK, obviously now not a part of the EU, but still we're independently forming these pieces of legislation, and I'm pretty sure most European countries also have their country level legislation which would be very, very similar. So when a cloud provider then is talking to customers, and particularly if they're a EU-based cloud provider, and those are fairly large customers with over 250 million revenue, they're going to have to be very understanding, have the systems in place to measure their scope 3 emissions, and like you say, the supply chain attributes of that are agreed. When you're looking at a data center, now I can understand the hyperscalers having real challenges with this, because they can't guarantee where your workloads are going to be, on what hosts they're going to be running on. Our cloud providers can pretty much do that. They're less generic in that respect. They do multi-tenant infrastructure, but it will be down to the cluster level, so they'll know which cluster it's running on, and in all likelihood that cluster is running on the same sort of hardware versions. But what else needs to be taken into account? What about kind of cooling, backup generators, all that type of stuff? Does that need to be pulled into that calculation as well?
Yeah, and effectively some of that is obviously proportionate to the client rather than being dedicated. Obviously, it depends on what's in the data center. But yeah, typically what we're doing then is looking, as you said, at a rack level for the power draw, and then the proportion of the facility that's associated with the customer in terms of the overall cooling and all the associated lighting and other facilities that go on around that.
Yeah.
So that in effect, it really depends who owns the data center, but effectively that is the provider's scope 2 emissions, which is the customer's scope 3.
Yeah.
This is where it gets interesting as a supply chain. And then the scope 3 emissions is the embodied emissions from the kit, including the on-prem network switching that is providing that service to the customer. So it depends what the customer requires from the provider in terms of that reporting.
Yeah.
So it is led by the customer. So a customer will typically ask, what are the scope 3 emissions associated with the supply, which is the scope 2 predominantly from a service provider perspective. Yeah. But somebody like the UK government will say, no, we want to know your scope 3 emissions as well. So we need a calculation for the equipment that you're using to provide our service. And that includes you telling us how long you're going to keep it for and what you're going to do with it at end of life.
Right. Right.
And this is where it becomes more difficult because the figures for, if we take end user computing as an example, the carbon footprint for devices is complex. And that's one of the things that we specialize in doing, is calculating that. But it's something you can find out. The further you go down the sort of data center trail through servers and into network switches, the less accessible and the less readily available that data becomes. Yeah. You've then also got to consider that, where you run the equipment does have a direct effect on the emissions, because you're drawing the power from the local grid. So if you're running this in Ireland, you will have a different carbon footprint to running it in the UK. Yeah. If you're running it in Holland in particular, you will have high emissions because of the use of fossil fuels. If you're running these in the Nordics, your scope 2 emissions are going to be minimal. Yeah. So scope 3 emissions will be consistent wherever you are in the world. That's the only variable really is the distance that the kit is shipped from its manufacturer to your point of use. But most life cycle analysis is done on assumptions worldwide rather than the specific metrics for you. So it becomes complicated, and also how long you're going to keep that.
I was going to ask you about that, because that's a bit of a double-edged sword. You've got, in one hand, keeping older servers is better because you're you're getting more bang for your buck out of it. You're increasing the longevity of the usage of the hardware that you've procured. But on the other side, that hardware could be, 5-7 years out of date in terms of optimized power supplies, optimized CPUs, and all the latest technology that can actually make it much more efficient. So what is is there a best practice or an approach that, customers as well as partners should be taking in that respect?
I mean, unfortunately, as a consultant, I would have to say it's complicated and it depends. So yeah, obviously, what you would do is look at the efficiency of that device, but you consider the embodied carbon, the scope 3 carbon that's associated with the manufacture and over how many years you're consuming that, and then the scope 2, which is effectively its efficiency in delivering those workloads. So it literally is, it's a projected calculation to say, well, if I replaced it with another piece of equipment, what is the scope 3 that's going to inflict, if you like, through the manufacture of that new device? And then over how many years would I need to run that in order to effectively pay that back? So you'll see similar calculations coming forward around things like electric vehicles. How many years would you need to keep an electric vehicle to offset the battery and its manufacture? And again, it's this full life cycle analysis and projection. And that's why we built out the models that we have, so that we can look at things like that and give advice to say, well, if you're considering this, this particular device over this number of years in comparison with this one, here's the footprint for both scenarios, and therefore you can make an informed decision around sustainability. But a bit like we're talking about that chain through the procurement system. It's thinking about that from a cost perspective. It's thinking about it from a utility, so a purchasing cost perspective, a utility cost perspective, and from a sustainability perspective. So you really, it's a weighted decision across all of those. But by having the figures, at least you can start to factor that into your decision making.
And I guess a lot of this stuff is just not going to be available. I mean, if you're on hardware now that's kind of 5 years old, you might have energy efficiency kind of rating against the hardware, but
it depends what you've got available from the DCIMS, or is there something that's giving you a per machine, or at the very least per rack level kilowatt hours per annum consumption that's going on. But yeah, I mean, we can work it out approximately, but again, it's hard to do that for a particular workload that may be spanning multiple devices, and obviously how much of each one is being used by that, and typically that's where a customer is coming from, is they're interested in a workload that's running. So putting an actual carbon footprint against that workload is very tough.
Yeah, well, there is some good news on the horizon with our area operations suite that VMware sells. Is we have I think it's called a green card or green score reporting. So we're using the data that we hold within the hypervisor to understand each VM's kind of energy consumption, and then providing that up as a report. But that's kind of only one level. It's the virtualized infrastructure, like you say. You've then got the underlying networking, the power supplies, et cetera, et cetera. And
the other thing obviously is that a lot of things directly affect both the scope 2 and the scope 3 emissions from a manufacturing level. So the operating system, the processors that are used, how long it runs for, whether it's upgradable and repairable, et cetera, they all contribute and have a significant impact to both scopes 2 and scope 3 emissions. We've done a lot of work around processes in particular, looking at the impact of different processes in devices and what that does to power consumption. And I suspect that that's going to become of increasing interest as the focus narrows onto this, and the data becomes more granular and transparent. Then those sorts of efficiencies are really going to be part of the decision-making criteria around what am I going to use. Whereas conventionally it was more cost and performance, sustainability will become part of that equation as well when you're considering, what servers am I going to put into that environment.
Yeah, I think this is going to get a little bit compounded. There's two kind of things that occur to me in this conversation. One is there's an exponential growth in data. There's a complete tsunami of data hitting enterprises and cloud providers alike, which in turn has a knock on because you've got to store that data somewhere. And that's going to cost you in terms of energy and all of the scope 2 emissions for the provider. But also modern applications. We've made great headway in kind of bringing virtualized workloads down to container level orchestration, which in some respects is better, and they execute faster and smaller. But then you've got the modern kind of data analytics and machine learning applications, which require very intensive graphical processing units and high performance compute, which I'm pretty sure is going to have serious impact on the amount of energy you consume.
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen the growth of NVIDIA in particular in terms of doing a lot of that AI, and the capabilities of that are fantastic. But yes, it comes at a cost in terms of energy, both in terms of the storage of the data that's being analyzed, but also that intensive processing. So one of the things that we've been looking at is where should those workloads run? Because if they're running locally within on a high performance workstation, what's the implications of that in comparison with running on a virtual instance of a desktop running within a very high performance data center? So again, it's a complicated topic. I mean, and it's also, we tend to view it from a technology perspective and start delving immediately into the performance and the metrics and the kilograms and all that. It's fundamentally a productivity issue. We're not using information technology randomly. We're using it to execute particular roles, and we're giving people the best tools in order to be productive in those roles. What we're then really saying with sustainability is we need to look at how that's delivered from a cost and an emissions perspective and determine the best way to deliver that. Can you rationalize it? Can you do less of it? Can you deduplicate the data? Can you dispose of it, archive it? Absolutely. Those efficiencies, as this becomes in effect a taxed area, if you like, where carbon emissions cease to be something that's in the background and they become economically sensitive, let's just put it that way, then the pressure to do that from a productivity perspective, to be more efficient in the way that we deliver and the way that we store and what we do and when we do it, that just starts to be another factor as well as pure cost. We've got an associated carbon cost that we really need to take into consideration.
And how have you seen hardware vendors kind of respond to this? I mean, for example, I think it's Dell who do recycling of servers now. Obviously that costs as well. Recycling takes energy, and it's going to take logistics and things like that. But has obviously CPUs get faster, get more kind of energy efficient as they kind of progress. But has there been any interesting developments in hardware vendors that you've seen, to try and make either provide information to the tooling to give you the transparency and metrics you need, or in terms of hardware design or process such as recycling?
We've certainly seen an increased interest in making the data available. I mean, it was one of the things that we really noticed when we were looking at the marketplace, and the data that was available for decision making was pretty limited. And it was also based on very specific assumptions from each manufacturer, and the certification that was available was again based on a set of assumptions. So one of the things that we did, we developed a tool, and again mostly from an end user computing perspective, to allow public sector and not-for-profit organizations to compare different devices that they might be considering buying for the carbon footprint of those devices as it applied to them. So where in the world are you going to use it and for how many years? And then we would normalize the data. So it's called the DCF, Dynamic Carbon Footprint Tool. So it normalizes the data, and then you can say, can I compare these 6 devices that I'm considering buying, which have similar functionality, and actually understand their scope 2 and scope 3 carbon footprint as it applies to us? Now, one of the reasons we did that and we made it free was to drive the equipment manufacturers to actually start producing the data. Because if you don't produce the data, you don't appear in the tool.
Right.
And so, what we've seen is an increase in the organizations providing that life cycle analysis data. So it is customer and market driven. So we are expecting that will increasingly happen across the server and the networking market as well. That customer demand for that data is going to start requiring more organizations to produce it. So we're where one of the the largest networking companies has started to produce Scope 3 emissions data for their switches. Again, we've been doing a lot of work with Microsoft around their operating systems at a device level, and they're very interested in how they could more accurately expose some of the power consumption data as well. So there's a lot going on at both an engineering and a product marketing level to start to improve some of those things and to make the data readily available. Because frankly, if you don't make it available, you won't make it past those gates that I mentioned.
Yeah, this is what I'm thinking. So, cloud providers, for example, they have very large agreements with hardware vendors. So, they'll be buying, I don't know, 500 power edge servers or 100 power edge services. And I think now maybe the way you weight those providers and the way you look at the equipment they're going to provide can't just be about the cost. It's also got to be about the balance of the performance, the footprint, the carbon footprint of those servers, which may force kind of new decision making in terms of who actually becomes your supplier for your hardware.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is, from a customer perspective, unfortunately, they may have particular things that they're focused on. So, I mean, you mentioned the Dell recycling. If that is of particular interest to a customer, they may well make that a real heavily weighted factor within their decision making, whereas it may not be the most effective thing that a vendor could do to reduce the carbon footprint. But customers will ultimately be saying, as the government has, I want to see a certain percentage of remanufactured devices as part of any major tender. So, that suddenly appears from left field. It's not something you've ever considered. And, most of us designing a cloud data center wouldn't be considering putting remanufactured devices in there. We're looking for something highly reliable, resilient, and flexible, rather than wanting to use recycled or remanufactured components. But if that's the customer's requirement, and that becomes commonplace across the largest customers, then it is something that's going to have to be considered. But it's kind of hard to react to some of those as they appear as a requirement that certainly wasn't in our minds when we started, designing the service we were going to deliver.
Yeah, I think there's just thinking about the sort of cloud provider audience. This is really relevant to obviously public sector. We've talked about to some extent. The public sector is always going to be, I think, leading in some of the ESG kind of principles and guidelines and enforcements that cloud providers need to take notice of in their nation state. But also, with the EU legislation, if you're an EU provider, you definitely need to be getting up to speed with what do I need to provide, what's the EU guidance, and what is my national guidance for metering my scope 2 and the customer's scope 3. What do I need to provide to them? I guess this is a great opportunity then for things like hyper-converged infrastructures, where you're getting, a server rack from Dell, which will do, your VMware Cloud Foundation. It will provide all the cloud stuff that you need. And then it will, because it's a set unit with storage, compute, and everything in it, it's probably those sort of things are going to probably become more beneficial in some respects, because they're just going to be easier to get hold of and known quantity.
Hyperconvergence, as you say, it brings it all together. It's extremely efficient in the way that it transmits data. You've got all the caching and other benefits. So anything that's driving that efficiency in terms of delivering compute is probably also delivering benefits from a sustainability perspective. So keeping all of that together and integrated into a service stack, if you like, is likely to be extremely efficient and easier, as you say, to actually measure in terms of what's being provided to the customer from that stack.
So Ewen, just to kind of wrap up then, in your mind, what are some of the guidance and advice you give our cloud providers out there on, we've spoken about public sector, we've spoken about legislation, we've spoken about the complexity of looking at their scope 2 and what they need to provide scope 3. Is there any, sources of truth or, things that could help a service provider understand more about their sustainability their footprint, their operations, etc. Is there, somewhere I can go where there's this huge list of stuff that I've got to work out how to measure? Because you kind of need that all-encompassing scope, don't you?
I'm not sure there's a place where you can go that gives you all of the information you're going to need. I think it's more, starting to consider, and when I say starting, I mean fairly rapidly consider how you're going to meet the information demands from the customers for the services that you provide. So if you're not already doing that granular level of reporting, then you definitely need to be doing that. You need to be looking at, where you're sourcing your power from and ensuring that is, as sustainable as possible, because again, that will be a question. Looking at your metrics as an organization in terms of your net zero strategy, what does that encompass? Is it just scope 1 and scope 2, or does it encompass scope 3 as well? Certification levels, and then really looking, as I say, when you're starting to consider your next generation, your technology refresh, ensuring that you have that requirement on the providers to put sustainability in at 30% of your weighting, if you like. Alongside cost, alongside functionality, alongside the flexibility that you might be looking for, make sustainability one of those metrics in selecting the devices, and then let that filter through into your carbon reduction plan and show that you're making year-on-year improvements, because that's what the customers are going to be looking for. They're not expecting everybody to be perfect today. We know, nobody is. So it's, have you benchmarked where you are? Have you taken positive steps to reduce your footprint moving forwards? And then are you tracking that on a monthly, annual basis to show that you're trending in the same way as the customers are towards their net zero targets? Are you doing the same from a service provision perspective, and can you prove it? So I think, those are the things really I would say is it's having that story, making sure it's credible, and then making sure that the direction of travel you're on is genuine and referenceable.
Ewen, thank you very much for your time today. It's been really interesting to kind of talk to you about this and, get your view and PX3's kind of vast knowledge that you guys have got in terms of, the tooling that you've created, for example, the approach and methodology that you're taking. And hopefully our cloud providers will now kind of have a better idea of what they've got to really get very fast, up to speed with their zero carbon committed strategy, which is a program in VMware, but also their in data center, their complete scope 2 attributes, and start looking at providing transparency to customers. Absolutely. Brilliant, Ewen. Thank you very much.
No, thanks for the opportunity. It'd be great to talk to you again.
And you.